Why do we do the top 40 tax dodgers chart? We've been doing it for a number of years now. And there's 9 years now of data. We do it because we want to shine a light on the biggest scam in the world by dollar value. And that is multinational tax avoidance, where tens of billions of dollars a year are siphoned out of countries like Australia to tax havens without paying tax. What's the point of paying tax? So that we can live in a civil society. We can pay for a police force. We can pay for an army to defend the country. We can pay for hospitals, schools, roads, and bridges. These are the reasons why we pay tax. But unfortunately, some companies, like our winner for the past couple of years, ExxonMobil Australia, the gigantic oil company, they have not paid 1 cent in tax for 9 years in Australia. How do they do it? They do it by making massive loans to themselves from overseas and paying the interest on that loan, because interest comes before tax and the interest flows overseas. So what is the scam in its essence? The scam is the worst tax avoiders in Australia are generally foreign multinational companies because they have the scope to do it. They have associate companies overseas and they do deals. And they siphon money out of Australia to other countries. Why do they do that? Because corporations in Australia, whether it's a small businessman or the gigantic foreign multinational, every company is required to pay 30% corporate income tax rate. But that 30% tax is on profit, not total income. You can make a gazillion and still not pay a cent in tax, because the essence of it is, if you make a profit, you have to pay tax on it. Therefore, the aim is not to make a profit in Australia because you pay 30%. It is to make your profit in Bermuda, where the tax rate is 0, or the Cayman Islands, where the tax rate is also 0, or Singapore, where the tax rate may be 5% or 3% for a big company. This is the point of it. Somehow get your cash and move it offshore. Some companies are much more aggressive than others. And so it is that we find the concentration, the biggest tax avoiders, of 9 years of data, and that is a very large, long sample size now. The worst tax avoiders of all are the foreign multinational oil and gas companies and coal companies. The usual offenders are on our list again this year. ExxonMobil at the top. We've got Peabody, Yancoal. We've got some energy companies. We've got a bunch of gas companies, Shell's BG, which is a gas fracking company. We've got Santos, which is a domestic multinational. So how do they do it? They make loans to themselves from overseas and the interest on those loans goes overseas. Companies like Exxon and Chevron have tens of billions of dollars sitting on their balance sheet every year in loans from themselves, from another Exxon or Chevron or Shell or BP company overseas. The 4 oil majors are past masters at tax avoidance. They are the worst. Also blowing up the planet, but that is another issue. Do they contribute to the societies in which they operate? No, they don't. They claim, oh, we make all this money in PAYG for our employees and GST. Actually, they collect the PAYG. They collect the GST. That's what they do. Corporate income tax, a lot of these companies pay 0. ExxonMobil, $100 billion in total income. What profit did they make during that time? What taxable income did they record? 0, because they took all that cash overseas. They funneled it out and therefore paid 30% of 0, which is 0. So when we hear tales in the Murdoch press about welfare bludgers, remember that the biggest welfare bludgers are the corporate welfare bludgers. Indeed, like Rupert Murdoch himself, who manages to pay tax on his News Corporation cash flow of 0 income tax in Australia year after year, while attacking welfare bludgers. How does Rupert do it? He does it by loading up the costs in the Australian subsidiaries, in the Australian companies, and by making the profits elsewhere. He does it also, to be more technical, by creating this souffle of costs. They're fake costs, called Goodwill, having all this goodwill on his balance sheet and then sucking out that goodwill via returns of capital to Rupert's other entities in other foreign jurisdictions. That's how Rupert does it. The pharma companies, they all make sure they pay just a little bit of tax relative to their income in order to look like good corporate citizens, because of course there's a $15 billion subsidised scheme here called the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, and the government is paying for it. So they make immense profits by marking up their drugs, which cost them very little to produce after the initial research costs. Very little. Each little pill costs very little to manufacture in China or Switzerland, or indeed Australia. They make huge profit margins, but they make very little in the way of profit, and then they pay a little bit of tax. They do it by what they call transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is pricing something in one jurisdiction overseas differently than you price it here. So your product here sells cheaply to, let's say, Singapore. The coal companies have done this too. You sell yourself in another entity your products here, let's just say your coal or your oil and gas. It goes to Singapore at a low price, because the lower the price, probably the lower the royalties you pay as well as tax. And then when it gets to Singapore, they sell it on to China or the end customer in Germany at a higher price, which means a greater profit. So their German or their Japanese or their Chinese company makes the profit, where the tax rate is lower. It's better if you can go through a tax haven. Singapore, where the tax rate might be 5%, varies according to what sort of company you are and the size of the company in Singapore and whether you're headquartered there. They do special sweetheart deals for bigger companies. The idea is you get your products out at a low price, then you jack up the prices in another country. How do IKEA and Virgin Australia do it? They do it through intellectual property payments to Richard Branson. Virgin Australia is near the top of our list yet again. Virgin Australia has never made a profit in Australia. How do they operate? How does any normal company in Australia operate for 9 years without making a profit? In Virgin's case, it's closer to 15 years since they started here. Why have they not made a profit? Surely you'd go bankrupt. No, because they're making the profit somewhere else. And Branson, no doubt, although you can't see it in the financial statements, is getting a royalty payment for the Virgin brand, and that is undisclosed. In the case of IKEA, intellectual property payments go out to Europe, to a tax haven in Europe. In the case of Google, the intellectual property may be held in Bermuda or somewhere like that. And so these huge service agreement payments go out every year. Billions of dollars in service fees to other Google entities. The service fees are often intellectual property. Google is saying, we invented this intellectual property, this Google algorithm in another country, so therefore that country should get the economic benefit arising from that, which is fair. It's a fair argument. The only problem is proportionality. How much tax should they be paying here? Google, as well as the other IP companies, are notorious tax dodgers. The ATO is catching up to them a bit. They pay a bit now, most of them, a little bit. Google and Facebook and Amazon. Apple now pays quite a bit, given its enormous revenue here. But they do it through intellectual property payments. Service fees, and you can see it in the notes to their financial statements, buried, interred at the back of their financial statements. Oh, here we go. There's $8 billion in service fees that's gone to some entity overseas. They're saying this revenue belongs overseas because we are using Google's overseas intellectual property in Australia. And as I said, fair, but it's just how much is fair. And can the ATO police every one of these deals? No, they can't. Now, the answer to this is not talk fests and conferences in Geneva for the G7 or the OECD. These are just delaying tactics in addressing the problem because, of course, they rely on American assent. They rely on America saying, yes, we would like a fairer system where our companies, like Google, pay more tax to other countries' governments. So that's not going to happen. These are largely, not totally, but largely a waste of time. But the Australian government has the ability to tax these companies for the money they make selling their goods and services to Australian citizens for Google on an Australian computer in Australia, advertising Australian services and goods. Why should this money all drift overseas? There are lots of different ways you can siphon that money out. And the ATO can come and address all these different methods like the debt loading, all these interest payments and things like that. But ultimately, it takes political determination. And these companies have all got lobbyists. And every time there's a move to tax them more, they're into the parliamentarians' chambers down in Parliament House, complaining and whinging about free markets and sovereign risk. They're very powerful. But it can be done, because in order to fund Australia's future, the biggest and richest institutions and the wealthiest people have to be taxed. You can't keep taxing ordinary workers out of existence. Well, there's companies like ExxonMobil making $100 billion while paying zero tax. It does not stack up. It will have to be addressed. It only makes sense that those that can afford to pay the most, that indeed rip all this money, billions out of Australia every year to tax havens, that they are the ones that should share the burden of paying for essential infrastructure and services in the countries in which they operate, like this country. There is only one answer. You have to tax these big companies more.